The carpenter installing new floorboards in the abandoned Appalachian homestead stopped mid-swing when his hammer punched through rotted wood into a hidden compartment. Inside lay a child's primer, the pages filled with careful lettering that grew increasingly desperate toward the end. The final entry read, "I have not seen the sky in 7 years." Elijah Pritchett arrived in Watauga County, North Carolina, on the 15th of November, 1876, carrying the leather-bound ledger that marked him as a federal census enumerator. The mountain hollows of Appalachia presented unique challenges for men in his profession. Roads existed more as suggestions than certainties, and families in these remote settlements often viewed government representatives with suspicion bordering on hostility. Yet Pritchett took pride in his thoroughness. Every household would be documented, every resident counted and recorded in the official registry of a nation still healing from civil war. The Garrick family farm sat 3 miles beyond the last marked trail, accessible only by a narrow path that wound through stands of hemlock and laurel. Smoke rose from the stone chimney of a weathered clapboard house, its construction suggesting at least 2 generations of occupation. Pritchett noted the well-maintained barn, the organized woodpile, the evidence of industrious inhabitants. A man emerged from the house before Pritchett could knock, his weathered face studying the visitor with careful neutrality. "Name's Garrick, Seth Garrick. Federal business?" Pritchett explained his purpose, producing credentials that Seth examined with the skepticism of a man who rarely encountered official documents. The family patriarch called into the house, and within minutes, Pritchett found himself seated at a rough-hewn table, while Seth's wife, Martha, poured chicory coffee into tin cups. 2 children, a boy and girl, both appearing to be in their early teens, watched from the doorway with quiet curiosity. The interview proceeded according to standard protocol. Seth Garrick, age 43, farmer. Martha Garrick, age 41, housewife. Their son Ezra, 14. Their daughter Abigail, 12. Pritchett's pen scratched across the census form, recording occupations, literacy status, property values. Then he reached the question that would haunt his professional conscience for years to come. "Any other residents of this household, Mr. Garrick?" The briefest hesitation. Martha's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Seth's calloused fingers drummed once against the table before going still. 2 more. Another boy and girl. Younger ones. Pritchett's pen hovered over the page. "Might I have their names and ages for the record?" "Jesse and Ruth. Boys 9, girls 6. Seth's voice carried the flat finality of a man closing a door. "They're sleeping. Sickly children. Keep mostly to themselves upstairs." Something in the statement felt rehearsed, polished smooth by repetition. Pritchett glanced toward the ceiling, noting how the family's eyes deliberately avoided following his gaze. No sounds came from above, no footsteps or voices that might indicate children in residence. The silence felt heavy, deliberate, as though the house itself conspired in concealment. Standard procedure dictated that enumerators verify the presence of all reported residents when possible. Pritchett opened his mouth to request a brief introduction to the absent children, but Martha's expression stopped him. Not hostile, not frightened, but carrying a weight of exhausted resignation that spoke of battles already fought and lost. Seth's hand moved almost imperceptibly to rest on his wife's shoulder. Pritchett recorded the names Jesse and Ruth Garrick in his ledger. He finished his coffee, thanked the family for their cooperation, and departed down the mountain path. Behind him, the Garrick house returned to its calculated stillness, keeping secrets that would not emerge for another 47 years. 3 weeks after Pritchett's visit, Dr. Owen Fulbright made the difficult journey to the Garrick farm. Ezra had developed a persistent fever, and mountain families reluctantly called for physicians only when home remedies failed. Fulbright had practiced medicine in Watauga County for 12 years, long enough to recognize the isolation that shaped these communities. He'd delivered babies in conditions that would horrify his colleagues in Raleigh, set bones by lantern light, and learned that survival in these mountains required adaptations the outside world would never comprehend. The boy's fever broke within 2 days of treatment. On the third day, as Fulbright prepared to leave, he heard it. A shuffling sound from above, rhythmic and deliberate, unlike the random creaking of settling timber. Then lentissimo, abrupt and total, as though movement had been deliberately stilled. "Squirrels in the attic," Martha said quickly. "Gets worse in cold weather. They nest in the rafters." Fulbright had heard squirrels in countless attics. This wasn't squirrels. The weight suggested something substantially larger. The pattern too measured, too purposeful. He glanced at the ceiling, then at Martha's face. What he saw there wasn't deception, but something far more complex. Exhaustion, fear, and beneath both, a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of wounded animals guarding injured young. He didn't press the matter, but the sound followed him down the mountain path. Understanding came 6 months later through a leather journal Fulbright discovered in his deceased father's effects. His father, also a physician, had maintained detailed case notes spanning 4 decades of practice. One entry from 1853 described treating a young man named Josiah Garrick for a broken leg. The notation was clinical until the final paragraph. Patient exhibits bilateral ectrodactyly of severe presentation. Both hands show fusion of digits into claw-like formations, but similarly affected. Patient reports grandfather bore identical condition. Family has chosen isolation over societal interaction. Cannot fault their reasoning given prevalent attitudes toward physical difference. Fulbright sat in his study as autumn rain drummed against the windows. Ectrodactyly, split-hand malformation, a hereditary condition that caused fingers and toes to fuse together, creating formations that crude observers might compare to lobster claws. The medical literature documented families where the trait passed through multiple generations. The condition affected only physical structure, leaving mental faculties entirely intact. Yet in an era when physical difference invited not merely prejudice, but outright violence, such families faced impossible choices. He remembered treating Ezra and Abigail. Their hands had appeared normal, fully formed with proper digit separation. But genetics followed capricious patterns. In families carrying ectrodactyly, some children inherited normal anatomy, while others did not. If Seth and Martha had hidden 2 younger children, if those children bore the family's hereditary condition, then what he'd heard in that attic suddenly carried devastating meaning. 3 days later, Fulbright returned to the Garrick farm under pretense of checking on Ezra's recovery. Seth met him in the yard, positioned to prevent approach to the house. The conversation remained cordial, but firm. Ezra had recovered completely. The family required no further medical attention. Winter was coming, and the mountain paths would soon become impassable. Best for the doctor to focus his attention on settlements more easily accessible. Fulbright held Seth's gaze. In the older man's eyes, he saw something that transcended simple secrecy. He saw a father who had made calculations no parent should face. Protection versus isolation. Safety versus childhood. The preservation of children's bodies at the cost of their ability to exist in the world. "If circumstances change," Fulbright said carefully, "if medical attention becomes necessary for any member of your household, send word. I'll come regardless of weather or season." Seth's shoulders relaxed fractionally. "Appreciated, Doctor." Fulbright rode away, knowing he'd just become complicit in something he couldn't fully articulate. Above him, through a gap in heavy curtains covering a second-floor window, he caught the briefest glimpse of a small, pale hand pressed against glass. Then the curtain fell, and the house returned to its guarded silence. Reverend Thomas Ashby believed in the transformative power of Christian fellowship. When he arrived in Watauga County in 1877, he set about visiting every family within a 20-mile radius, determined to bring isolated mountain households into spiritual community. The Garrick family presented a particular challenge. They attended no services, received no visitors, and occupied their remote hollow with an insularity that bordered on hostility. Ashby made 3 attempts before gaining entry to their home. On a Sunday afternoon in late March, he found Martha alone in the yard, hanging laundry on a rope line stretched between 2 birch trees. She couldn't refuse his request for water after his long walk, and basic hospitality demanded she invite him inside while she fetched it. The house's interior surprised him with its order and cleanliness. Books lined a shelf near the fireplace, more than he'd expected in such a remote dwelling. A spinning wheel occupied one corner, baskets of carded wool beside it. Evidence of industry and education, contradicting assumptions about mountain families. Ashby cataloged these details for his monthly report to the church council. Proof that even isolated souls possessed civilization's refinements. Then he heard the footsteps above. Not the random creaking he'd initially dismissed, but deliberate movement. Someone pacing, the rhythm suggesting restlessness or agitation. He glanced at the ceiling, noting how the floorboards were unusually thick, the construction heavier than standard residential requirements would demand. "Your husband in?" Ashby asked, accepting the tin cup Martha offered. Working the back field. Her eyes never left his face, watchful in a way that suggested she was calculating his every reaction. "And your children? I'd hoped to meet the whole family." "Ezra and Abigail are helping their father. The younger ones are resting upstairs." She positioned herself between Ashby and the staircase, the movement casual but unmistakably intentional. "They're not well. Best not to disturb them." The footsteps continued overhead. Not the shuffling of sick children confined to bed, but active movement. Ashby heard something else, too, a rhythmic tapping that might have been knuckles rapping against wood. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. Deliberate, communicative. "Perhaps I might offer a prayer for their recovery," Ashby suggested, moving toward the stairs. "A brief blessing, nothing that would tax their strength." Martha's hand shot out, gripping his forearm with surprising force. "No." The word carried absolute finality. Ashby stared at her fingers, noting how her knuckles whitened with the intensity of her grip. When she released him, he saw something flicker across her face. Not anger, but terror, barely contained. "Reverend, I appreciate your concern." Her voice steadied, though her hands trembled. "But some burdens are private. Some situations don't improve with outside intervention, no matter how well-intentioned." Above them, the tapping stopped. The silence felt weighted with listening presence, as though whoever occupied that upper floor was waiting to learn whether they'd been discovered or remained hidden. Ashby found himself unnerved by the quality of that silence, the way it seemed to hold its breath. He left without meeting the younger Garrick children, but his curiosity had sharpened into something more urgent. That evening, he recorded his observations in the detailed journal he maintained of parish visits. The Garrick household conceals something irregular. 2 children reported in residence but never observed. Movement heard from sealed upper floor suggests active occupancy, not convalescence. Family demonstrates extreme anxiety regarding external contact with these hidden individuals. Situation warrants continued observation. What Ashby couldn't have known was that his journal entry would become evidence in an investigation conducted 4 decades hence, that his careful documentation of suspicious circumstances would provide the first official acknowledgement that something deeply wrong had taken root in that isolated hollow, that the tapping he'd heard was a code 2 children had developed to communicate between their sealed rooms, the only conversation they were permitted beyond their parents' carefully supervised interactions. The house kept its secrets, but those secrets were beginning to leave traces in the historical record. The architectural modifications to the Garrick House began in 1868, according to lumber receipts discovered in the county archives. Seth had purchased quantities of timber far exceeding normal repair requirements, along with specialized hardware, heavy-duty hinges, iron brackets, rope pulleys, and an unusual amount of oiled canvas. The purchases came in careful intervals, never enough at once to attract notice, but over 3 years they accumulated into something substantial. A surveyor's map from 1892, created when the county reassessed property boundaries, provided the first external documentation of what Seth had built. The house's upper floor measured significantly smaller than the ground level, creating an unexplained gap of nearly 8 feet between interior and exterior walls. The surveyor noted this discrepancy, but attributed it to measurement error or unconventional construction typical of mountain homesteads. What the surveyor couldn't see was the ingenious system Seth had engineered within those walls. A cistern in the attic, fed by gutters and rainfall, provided water supply without requiring trips outside. The pulley system ran through hollowed wall spaces, allowing meals to be raised from the kitchen directly to the second floor without opening doors or creating opportunities for observation. Ventilation shafts disguised as chimney flues provided air circulation. Seth had essentially created a self-contained living space, a world within a world. The modifications revealed a man who understood he was building not temporary accommodation, but permanent imprisonment. Every detail suggested long-term habitation. Waste disposal through a chute that emptied into a sealed underground chamber, later excavated during property clearing in 1931. Storage compartments built into wall cavities for clothing and personal items. Even crude plumbing that predated municipal water systems by decades, demonstrating Seth's desperate innovation. But the most haunting detail emerged from examination of the walls themselves. Between the interior and exterior surfaces, workers in 1923 found layers of sound-dampening material, wool batting, cork sheets, even packed earth and sawdust. Seth had constructed these walls not merely for privacy, but for absolute acoustic isolation. Whatever occurred in those rooms would remain unheard by anyone outside. The windows presented their own evidence, heavy wooden shutters reinforced with iron bars, designed to open only from the exterior. The glass itself was unusual, thick and wavy, the type used in institutions rather than homes. On the interior surfaces, scratches formed patterns that later analysis suggested were attempts at marking time. Crude calendars etched into glass by fingers that had no other means of tracking the passage of days. One window frame yielded particularly disturbing evidence. Carved into the wood in letters barely a quarter-inch high were the words, "Ruth Garrick was here, 1874. The carving suggested painstaking effort, probably accomplished over weeks or months, using whatever implement a child could access. Perhaps a nail, perhaps a shard of broken pottery. The desperation required to leave such a mark To insist on one's existence in the only way available spoke to psychological conditions that transcended physical confinement. Seth's construction demonstrated both love and monstrosity. He'd built protection, yes, but protection that required his children to sacrifice childhood, sunlight, fresh air, human contact, and the basic freedom to exist in the world. The walls that kept cruelty out also kept innocence locked within. Every nail driven, every board fitted, represented a father's calculation that imprisonment by family was preferable to destruction by society. The house's architecture became a three-dimensional document of impossible choices. Future historians would walk through these modified spaces and struggle to determine whether Seth Garrick was protector or jailer, whether his actions constituted salvation or a different form of violence. The walls themselves offered no easy answers, only the cold fact of what they'd contained and for how long they'd held it secret. The general store ledger in Boone told a story its keeper never consciously recognized. Every 6 weeks, with mechanical regularity, Seth Garrick purchased supplies that defied the arithmetic of his visible household. 4 people living on the farm, yet orders included 6 sets of winter undergarments. Meals for 4, yet flour and cornmeal quantities sufficient for twice that number. The storekeeper, Hiram Vance, recorded these transactions without question. Mountain families often bought in bulk, especially those living far from town. But a neighbor named Cora Lansing noticed what Vance missed: her own purchases. Recorded in the same ledger, provided comparison. Her family of 6 consumed roughly the same provisions as the Garrick's supposed 4. She mentioned this oddity to her husband one evening in 1878, expressing it as curiosity rather than accusation. Her husband advised her to mind her affairs. Mountain courtesy demanded respecting others' privacy, even when that privacy sheltered obvious secrets. The Lansing farm sat 2 miles from the Garricks, close enough that Cora occasionally encountered Martha on the trail to town. Their conversations remained superficial, confined to weather and crops, but Cora observed details that accumulated into troubling patterns. Martha always appeared exhausted, her movements carrying the weight of someone bearing invisible burdens. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hands, roughened by endless labor, showed calluses in unusual places, suggesting tasks beyond typical farm work. More telling were the children's clothes Martha purchased. Cora watched her select fabrics and measure lengths, noting how Martha bought for sizes that didn't match Ezra and Abigail. Smaller garments, items appropriate for younger children. When Cora casually mentioned her own daughter had outgrown several dresses that might fit Martha's younger ones, Martha's face closed like a shuttered window. She declined the offer with thanks, then changed the subject so abruptly that Cora felt she'd trespassed on forbidden ground. The community's collective silence wasn't ignorance, but choice. 3 families within visiting distance of the Garrick farm had heard sounds in the night. Strange calls that might have been children playing, except they came from the Garrick property at odd hours, and the Garrick children were supposedly asleep. Old Samuel Pruitt, whose land bordered the Garrick's eastern boundary, once mentioned hearing what sounded like crying carried on the wind. His wife hushed him immediately, reminding him that decent people didn't gossip about neighbors' private affairs. This code of silence served multiple purposes. Partially, it reflected mountain culture's emphasis on self-reliance and non-interference, but it also revealed darker truths about the community's own fears. Several families in the region carried their own secrets, their own members who didn't quite fit society's narrow definitions of acceptable. A cousin with seizures kept in a back room, an uncle whose mind never developed beyond childhood, a daughter whose face bore disfiguring scars from a childhood fire. These families recognized that scrutiny could flow in multiple directions. Better to maintain mutual blindness than risk having their own vulnerabilities exposed. The shopkeeper's ledger preserved proof of community complicity. Every transaction represented not merely commerce, but acknowledgement. Vance saw the discrepancies in quantities purchased versus family size. Cora observed Martha's exhaustion and the mysterious children's clothing. Samuel heard sounds that suggested hidden inhabitants. They all chose not to pursue these observations to their logical conclusions. Years later, when investigators examined these records, they would struggle to understand how an entire community could know without acknowledging knowledge. But that's precisely how systematic concealment functions. Not through one person's deception, but through collective agreement to not quite see, not quite hear, not quite question. The Garrick family didn't maintain their secret alone. They had accomplices in every neighbor who noticed something wrong and deliberately looked away. Martha Garrick's letters to her sister in Tennessee, preserved in a family Bible, provided the only direct testimony of the parents' internal struggle. Written between 1873 and 1881, these letters never explicitly named what they concealed, yet every line trembled with the weight of it. "We do what we must to keep them safe," Martha wrote in April of 1875. "Seth says the world is not ready for children like ours. I pray he is wrong, but I have seen what happens in town. The stares, the whispers, worse than whispers. A woman in Boone told me God marks the wicked through their offspring. She didn't know she was speaking of my own blood, but her words cut deep nonetheless." Another letter, dated September 1876, revealed a specific incident that hardened their resolve. Ezra had accompanied Seth to town for supplies. A group of men outside the saloon had cornered the boy, demanding to see his hands. They'd heard rumors about the Garrick bloodline, whispers of deformity passed down through generations. When Ezra showed them his normal, fully formed fingers, the men laughed and let him pass. But their intent had been clear. They were hunting for evidence of difference, ready to respond with violence if they found it. "Seth came home that night and wept," Martha wrote. "I have never seen my husband cry before. He said if Ezra had been born like Jesse and Ruth, those men would have hurt him, possibly killed him. He said we made the right choice keeping the younger ones hidden. But I wonder, sister, I wonder if there is any right choice in a situation so wrong." The letters documented the psychological toll of their decision. Martha described sleepless nights listening to footsteps overhead, knowing her children walked the same 20 feet of space repeatedly, because it was the only ground they were permitted to cover. She wrote of Jesse's questions, asked through the wall at the top of the stairs, where Martha sometimes sat to talk with him. Why couldn't he go outside? When would people stop being afraid? Would he ever meet anyone besides his family? "I have no answers that don't break my heart," Martha confessed. "I tell him soon, always soon. But soon never comes, and he grows quieter with each passing year. Ruth stopped asking questions altogether. She sits by her window and watches birds. Sometimes I hear her, crying, very soft, as though she's learned that tears must be silent too." The letters revealed another devastating detail. Martha and Seth had considered alternatives. In 1877, they'd inquired about an institution in Virginia that claimed to provide compassionate care for individuals with physical differences. The response they received described conditions that amounted to exhibition and experimentation. Residents were displayed to medical students, subjected to measurements and procedures without consent. and confined in circumstances that made the Garrick attic seem merciful by comparison. "At least at home they are loved," Martha wrote after receiving that letter. "At least they know their worth comes not from how their bodies appear, but from who they are. I tell myself this daily. Some days I almost believe it." Seth's perspective emerged only once, in a letter Martha quoted. He'd apparently written to a physician in Charleston, describing his children's condition without identifying himself, asking what future they might have in a society that recoiled from physical difference. The physician's response was brutal in its honesty. Institutionalization, social rejection, or perpetual concealment were the only realistic options for individuals bearing visible deformities. "Seth burned that letter," Martha wrote. "Then he went upstairs and spent the evening teaching Jessie carpentry through demonstration. Their hands working on opposite sides of the wall. He is trying to give them skills, sister. Skills for a life he knows they may never get to live." The letters stopped in 1881. Whatever happened after that year remained undocumented, lost to time and deliberate erasure. The diary fragment was discovered in 1923, wedged between wall studs during demolition work. Written on pages torn from an old almanac, the entries were cramped and uneven, the handwriting suggesting limited practice. The ink had faded to brown, but the words remained legible. No name identified the author, but the content made attribution clear. This was Jesse Garrick's voice, speaking from his confinement. "Today, I am 12 years old," the first dated entry began, marked March 1877. "Mother brought cake through the wall opening. Ruth and I ate it while Mother sang on the other side. We could not see her face, but we could hear her trying not to cry. I wanted to tell her the cake was good, but my throat would not work properly." The entries weren't daily but sporadic, suggesting Jesse wrote when he acquired paper or when emotion demanded expression. He described his world in precise detail, born of having nothing else to observe. The knot in the floorboard near the window that resembled a horse's head. The way afternoon light created patterns on the wall, moving predictably as seasons changed. The spider that built webs in the corner each autumn, which Jessie named and mourned when it disappeared each spring. "Ruth talks to herself now," an entry from 1878 noted. "She creates voices for different people and has conversations with them. She told me yesterday that her friend Sarah said the sky is blue, like Mother's Sunday dress. I did not tell Ruth that I cannot remember what blue looks like. I think I knew once, but the color has left my mind." He documented their education, conducted through the wall by Martha. She would read aloud, teaching them letters and numbers, geography and history. But the lessons created strange gaps in knowledge. Jesse could recite state capitals, but had never walked through a town. He understood crop rotation, but had never touched soil. Ruth could identify constellations from descriptions, but had never seen stars. "Father explained mathematics to me today through the speaking hole," Jesse wrote in 1879. "He says I have a quick mind for figures. He says this will serve me well in the future. I did not ask what future he means. We both know there is no future that includes me." The most haunting entries describe Jesse's attempts to understand his own body. He wrote of examining his hands, the fused fingers that had sentenced him to isolation. He noted how they functioned differently, but not less effectively than normal hands. How he could grip and manipulate objects, write, and create despite the altered structure. The confusion of knowing his body worked perfectly well, while simultaneously understanding it, was the reason for his imprisonment. "I heard Ezra's voice yesterday. He was close to the house talking with Father about planting. His voice has gotten deeper. He sounds like a man now. I wonder if my voice would sound like that if I ever had reason to speak above a whisper. Ruth and I talk very quietly, always. We have learned that loud voices bring anxious footsteps and reminders to stay silent. One entry described hearing a thunderstorm through the walls, the first Jesse had experienced since early childhood. He pressed his ear to the exterior wall, trying to feel the vibrations, imagining rain on his face. Ruth asked me what rain tastes like. I said I thought maybe like tears, but cleaner. She said that made sense because rain was the sky crying. Then she asked why the sky was sad. I had no answer for that question either. The final entry was dated November 1880. I think I am forgetting how to be a real person. Sometimes I cannot remember if I am awake or dreaming. The walls and I have become the same thing. If they ever come down, I believe I might come down too. After that, the pages were blank. The winter of 1879 brought pneumonia to the mountains. It swept through Watauga County with particular cruelty, settling in lungs and refusing to release its grip. The Garrick household fell ill in January, all 6 members succumbing within days of each other. For Seth and Martha, the timing created a nightmare scenario. Their visible children could be treated. Their hidden ones could not without revealing what they'd concealed for over a decade. Dr. Fulbright's personal journal documented his mounting concern. He'd been treating Ezra and Abigail for 3 days when Seth finally pulled him aside on the 4th morning. The conversation occurred in the barn, away from the house, and Fulbright recorded it with careful precision. "There are 2 more sick," Seth had said, his voice hoarse from his own illness. "Upstairs. They've had fever for 5 days now, getting worse." Fulbright had known, of course, had suspected for years, but hearing Seth admit it forced the situation from shadow into terrible clarity. "I need to examine them," Fulbright said. "Immediately." What followed was a negotiation that haunted Fulbright for the remainder of his life. Seth pleaded for treatment without exposure, as though such a thing were medically possible. He offered money the family didn't have, promised future service, anything to avoid bringing a physician into those sealed rooms. But Fulbright understood what Seth wouldn't acknowledge. The children were dying. Without intervention, they had perhaps 2 days. With it, they might survive. But survival required Fulbright to enter their prison and witness what it had done to them. The doctor's notes described climbing those stairs with Seth and Martha, both parents trembling as they unlocked doors that perhaps hadn't opened fully in years. The smell hit him first, the accumulated staleness of inadequate ventilation. Then he saw them. Jesse, age 12, curled on a narrow bed, his breathing labored and wet. Ruth, age 9, unconscious in the adjacent room, her fever so high that her skin burned to touch. But what stopped Fulbright wasn't their illness. It was their hands and feet, the fused digits that had condemned them to this existence. He'd seen ectrodactyly before in medical texts, but confronting it in living children whose eyes held awareness and intelligence alongside desperate sickness, struck him differently. These formations weren't monstrous. They were simply different, variations in human structure that functioned adequately despite their unusual appearance. "How long have they been confined here?" Fulbright asked, already knowing the answer would devastate him. "Jesse since he was 5, Ruth since she was 3. Martha's voice broke. "Please, can you help them?" Fulbright treated them. He spent 4 days moving between all-tour children, administering medications, monitoring temperatures, applying poultices to break the congestion in their lungs. During those days, he witnessed the psychological damage that years of isolation had inflicted. Jesse flinched from direct eye contact, his social skills atrophied from disuse. Ruth couldn't tolerate Fulbright's proximity at first, pressing herself against the wall whenever he approached. They whispered rather than spoke at normal volume. They moved with the constrained caution of prisoners who'd learned to occupy minimal space. On the 5th day, the fevers broke. All 4 children would survive. But Fulbright faced a crisis that medicine couldn't resolve. He'd taken an oath to do no harm, yet walking away and allowing these children to return to their confinement seemed like harm of the most profound sort. Reporting the situation meant institutionalization, or worse. Doing nothing meant abandoning them to continued imprisonment. He sat in the Garrick kitchen while Seth and Martha waited for his decision. Outside, winter wind howled through bare trees. Inside, overhead, 2 children who'd just survived pneumonia settled back into rooms that would hold them for years to come. Fulbright opened his mouth to speak, to insist on intervention, to demand change. But the words that emerged surprised even him. "I'll return in 2 weeks to check their recovery. If you need me before then, send word immediately." He'd chosen complicity. The weight of that choice would never lift. Owen Fulbright couldn't forget what he'd seen in those rooms. The pneumonia crisis had cracked something open in him, a professional detachment that had allowed him to practice medicine in difficult circumstances without drowning in the misery he witnessed. Now that detachment failed him. He dreamed of Jesse's eyes, intelligent and aware, yet dulled by years of sensory deprivation. He woke thinking of Ruth pressing herself against the wall, terrified of human proximity, because humans meant only family voices through barriers. In March of 1880, Fulbright attended a medical conference in Richmond. The gathering focused primarily on surgical techniques, but one presentation caught his attention. A physician from Philadelphia described his work with a charitable organization advocating for individuals with physical differences. They were pushing for legal protections, challenging institutionalization practices, and documenting cases where prejudice rather than medical necessity dictated treatment. Fulbright approached the speaker afterward, describing a hypothetical case. 2 children with ectrodactyly, hidden by their family to avoid social persecution, now approaching adolescence, having spent most of their lives in isolation. What would this organization recommend? The Philadelphia physician's response was immediate and emphatic. The children needed exposure to the world, regardless of risk. Continued isolation would cause permanent psychological damage that would make eventual integration impossible. He provided contact information for advocacy groups, legal resources, even families who'd successfully navigated similar situations. He described children with ectrodactyly who attended school, held jobs, married, and lived ordinary lives once given the opportunity. Fulbright returned to Watauga County carrying this information like both weapon and burden. He visited the Garrick farm in early April, ostensibly to check on the family's recovery from winter illness. Seth met him with the usual wariness, but Fulbright insisted on speaking with both parents together. What happened in that conversation remained private until Fulbright's own journals were discovered decades later. He described laying out everything he'd learned: the advocacy organizations, the legal changes beginning to occur in progressive states, the documented cases of successful integration. He spoke of the psychological research emerging around prolonged isolation, how it damaged developing minds in ways that physical differences never could. "Your children's hands are not the problem," Fulbright had said. "The problem is that they've spent their childhood learning they must hide from the world. Every day in those rooms teaches them they're something shameful, something that must be concealed. That lesson will destroy them far more thoroughly than any prejudice they might face outside. Martha wept. Seth sat silent for long minutes before speaking. You don't know what people are capable of. You didn't see what happened to my father when he tried to live openly. The violence, the rejection. I'm protecting them from that. You're protecting them from life itself, Fulbright replied. And I've been helping you do it. I'm done with that. I can't force you to change, but I can no longer be complicit in this. Either you begin transitioning these children into the world, slowly and carefully, or I'll be forced to contact authorities who will make that decision for you. The ultimatum hung between them. Fulbright had essentially declared himself an enemy of the very family he'd protected for years. He watched Seth's hands curl into fists, saw Martha's expression shift from grief to something harder. He'd crossed a line, violated the unspoken agreement that had allowed him access to their secret. Get off my property, Seth said quietly. Don't come back. Fulbright left, knowing he'd failed. His intervention hadn't freed those children. It had merely ensured they'd receive no medical care going forward, that their isolation would become even more complete. He'd chosen conscience over pragmatism, and the children would pay the price for his principles. The Garrick property stood abandoned when researcher Adelaide Hoffman first encountered it in 1923. 3. She'd been investigating census anomalies across Appalachia, tracking families whose records suggested missing or misreported members. The 1876 census showed 6 Garricks. The 1880 census showed 4. No death certificates existed for Jesse or Ruth Garrick. They simply vanished from official record between those years, as though they'd never existed at all. Local inquiries yielded fragments. Seth and Martha had died in 1900 and 1902, their deaths attributed to influenza and heart failure respectively. Ezra had moved west in the 1890s. Abigail had married and relocated to Tennessee. No one remembered younger siblings. When Hoffman pressed, elderly residents offered vague recollections of whispers, of something odd about that family, but nothing concrete. The community's collective amnesia felt deliberate, a final act of complicity in maintaining secrets long past their usefulness. The house itself provided answers that living memory refused to supply. Hoffman hired workers to document the structure before planned demolition. What they found in those sealed upper rooms told a story that transcended individual tragedy and became something larger. Evidence of human adaptability under impossible circumstances. Jesse's carved calendar marking years in the wood. Ruth's collection of bird feathers, gathered somehow despite confinement, arranged by size and color. Books worn smooth from repeated reading. A primitive musical instrument fashioned from scrap materials, suggesting the children had created beauty in their prison. But other discoveries spoke to darker truths. Growth marks on door frames showing both children's stunted physical development. Medical texts from the era confirmed that prolonged lack of sunlight and limited movement would have affected their bone structure, their muscular development, their overall health. The children hadn't just been hidden, they'd been physically diminished by their concealment. Jesse and Ruth's ultimate fate remained unclear. Death records for North Carolina in the 1880s and 90s showed no matches. Hoffman theorized they might have died during those unaccounted years, buried quietly on family property without official documentation. Or perhaps they'd been moved, sent away to an institution that Seth and Martha could no longer avoid once Fulbright withdrew his cooperation. Some evidence suggested the latter. An 1883 letter in county archives referenced transport of 2 unnamed individuals to an asylum in Virginia, arranged through private channels. Hoffman's research didn't solve the mystery, but illuminated its implications. By 1923, medical understanding of ectrodactyly had advanced significantly. Surgical interventions existed that could separate fused digits, improving function and appearance. More importantly, social attitudes had begun shifting. Organizations advocated for individuals with physical differences. Laws protected against institutional abuse. The world that had seemed too dangerous for Jesse and Ruth was slowly, inadequately, becoming more humane. The tragedy wasn't merely what happened to 2 children. It was that their suffering purchased nothing of value. Their sacrifice to their parents' fear didn't protect them. It didn't change society. It simply removed them from existence, erasing 2 lives that might have contributed something meaningful had they been permitted to live openly. Modern medical understanding confirms that ectrodactyly causes no cognitive impairment. People born with this condition today lead full lives. Their challenges, primarily social rather than functional. Jesse and Ruth Garrick possessed intelligence, creativity, and emotional depth that their confinement could suppress but never eliminate. The evidence they left behind proves they were whole human beings, trapped not by their bodies, but by a world that couldn't see past physical difference to recognize their humanity. The sealed rooms still exist, preserved as part of a historical structure in Boone. Visitors walk through them now, reading plaques that explain what occurred there. Some leave flowers. Others leave notes expressing regret for suffering they couldn't prevent, happening long before their births. The house stands as testament to the damage caused when fear masquerades as protection, when isolation pretends to be love. If this story disturbed something in you, if it made you question how society treats those who are different, then that disturbance serves a purpose. Hit that like button and subscribe, because the past keeps teaching lessons we desperately need to learn.